Joji Nightmare Interactive Moon Cradle Igyo no Hanayome on 3DO is a December 1995 isometric mystery adventure developed by TOSE and published by Pack-in Video. We've talked a couple times on this channel about TOSE, but I think the publisher Pack-in Video was just a really funny name, and it's appeared a couple times. So in the mid-90s, when game systems started to move toward being CD-based as opposed to cartridge-based, with the purpose of being able to fit more onto the actual game, these games started to get like full motion video for cutscenes, and this game is super reliant on that. There's a ton of that. But the actual game itself is more like a point and click, and most of your most of your activity is just interacting with objects or other people. There's not a lot of info out there about this game, but it seems like you are investigating missing girls. And even though this game is completely stuck in Japan, this game, or at least a version of it, was ported to the Sega Saturn in June 1997. So very cool game to add to the collection. Shinki Sakai Evolutia on GameCube is a July 2002 JRPG compilation developed by Sting, the same developer as Dokapon Kingdom, and published by ESP Software in Japan. However, 4 months later, it was published by Ubisoft here in North America as Evolution Worlds. And this game is actually a remake compilation of 2 Dreamcast games. The first one is Evolution, The World of Sacred Device, and the second one is its sequel, Evolution 2, Far Off Promise, both of which were brought to North America at their respective times, just like within a year of their Japanese releases. And the compilation, the remake compilation, is mostly just a bunch of small changes from the originals, but the most notable change is that the first game, Evolution, The World of Sacred Device, is kind of abbreviated, shortened a little bit. So you play as several different researchers in the year 930, just a few years ago, who use these ancient tools called Psyframes, and the legend tells of an ancient Psyframe called Evolutia. And in both games, you follow a story where you search for it, along with all sorts of roguelike and dungeon-crawling battle mechanics, and the ultimate goal is to beat the main villain, Eugene. So, really cool piece to add to the collection. Puyan is an arcade game initially released in Japan in September of 1982, but quickly came to North America that same year. The game is best described as a horizontal version of like Galaga and Galaxian, which we've talked about a couple times here, but you play as Mama Pig, who moves vertically as you use a bow and arrow to shoot wolves off their balloons. Makes a lot of sense. And you occasionally throw some meat at them too. I don't know. It's just as silly as it sounds. The game was ported to all sorts of systems in the 80s, including the Atari 2600, the ColecoVision, and of course this 1985 Famicom port, but was also brought to the Wii Virtual Console, I'm pretty sure the Wii U Virtual Console, like only in Japan, and it was also brought to Switch and PS4 in 2019 under Hamster's Arcade Archives line of games. So, very cool piece to add this little piggy here to the collection. Shin Onigashima is a 1987 two-part Famicom Disk System text-based adventure developed by PAX Softonica and published by Nintendo, believe it or not, where you follow the story of 2 children, Donbei and Hikari, as they try to save their adoptive parents' souls. So during the story, you recruit Ringo the dog, Matsunosuke the monkey, and Ohana the pheasant, all of whom help you defeat the dragon and the one that sucked your parents' souls away. So 9 years later in 1996, an alternate / backstory version told from those recruited animal team members' vantage point was broadcast via the Super Famicom's Satellaview system, and it was received well enough that it was put on 2 separate cartridges released side by side in May 1998, so 2 years after the broadcast. That is Heisei Shin Onagashima Kohen and Zenpen. And this is a really cool dual release. The broadcast is a little cooler because, one, it was a broadcast game, and it was really cool because once you completed the story via the broadcast, you could play the original Famicom Disk System version via the broadcast. So the physical release doesn't have that, but the 2-part is still there. So there's several different versions of this game, like the original Famicom Disk System version, the Satellaview version, and so on. All of those have been re-released on previous virtual consoles. It's really, really cool, and it's cool to get both parts. Res Arcana Diana Ray Yoranai no Mekyu is an April 1995 fortune-telling sim developed by Marionette and published by the coolest publisher ever, Coconuts Japan. It's a fortune-telling sim, and you input different pieces of information. You put in when you were born. It was intended for Japan, so you put in where in Japan you live, and then you choose a card given a couple choices, which then tells your fortune. It's kind of funny. This isn't the first time that Nintendo would do or would allow a fortune-telling sim on their game. Previously, there was Taboo the Sixth Sense on NES, and then later on, there would be Tarot Mystery on the Super Famicom, so kind of weird little era of Nintendo games. But big thanks to GiantBomb.com for this one, because they gave me literally all the information for this game. So very cool to add this weird piece of Nintendo history to my collection. Yakochu on Super Famicom is a June 1995 visual novel developed by Athena, where you are the captain of a ship and you're voyaging across the sea, and you're coming across everything from, dealing with men overboard and ghosts. The supernatural is involved, and there's also like bees you have to deal with. You're on the water. I don't know how that happens, but it happens. There's some choices that affect the outcome of the story, but for the most part, it's really just text scrolling across the screen. But it is really cool that for a 1995 Super Famicom game, some of the images that the text scrolls across is super detailed and very, very pretty. So that's pretty neat. Would end up being ported to the Game Boy Color and would also have a sequel on the N64 in October 1999. But for the most part, this is kind of just a piece of Super Famicom history. So very cool piece to add to the collection. That's my version of Titanic. Refrain no Chika Meikyu Tomajo no Ryodan on PS Vita is a June 2016 dungeon crawler developed and published by Nipponichi Software, the same studio responsible for the Disgaea series. So in the game, you're traveling through various dungeons, but you serve as the movement by playing as a book controlled by a witch named Madame Dronia. All the combat is handled by dolls created by Dronia, but you're just the movement, I'm pretty sure. I think that's what I gathered. The story revolves around trying to uncover like lots of Dronia's past. I also think you're trying to revive souls that have passed along, and it sounded kind of creepy the first time I read through the plot, but the more I kept up with it, the more I read it, I was like, this seems more sad than anything. So the PS Vita version is stuck in Japan, but it was ported and brought to North America on PS4, Switch, and Steam in 2018 as a Labyrinth of Refrain, Coven of Dusk. So weird little release here, but it is pretty cool to add this to the collection. As a bit of a background for this game, the PC Engine was released in Japan in October 1987 by the company NEC, and it was supposed to be a competitor to the Famicom, where instead of playing cartridges, it would play these smaller Hue cards. The system was brought to North America as the TurboGrafx 16 just 2 years later in August 1989, but its legacy is totally overshadowed by the NES, the Super Nintendo, and also the Sega Genesis, so it never really stood a chance. However, in Japan in December 1988, it received a CD add-on that would also come to North America just about a year later in November 1989, but it improved the sound, it improved the graphics, but it also made it the first home video game console to use CDs, just like 6 years before the PS1 was released. So this game, Yamamura Misa Suspense, Kenseka Kei Izara Satsujin Jiken, was released for that CD add-on only in Japan in March 1992, developed by TOSC and published by Naxit Soft. So this beat-em-up is the fourth in a series of games based off a novel series written by Misa Yamamura, but it's the first to not be on Famicom. First three were on Famicom. This one, fourth game, not on Famicom. So the story goes that you're traveling as a magazine journalist for her job, and your protagonist witnesses a murder and just has to stick around and help figure out who did it. So cool little piece of gaming history here, the PC Engine, but cool to add a couple PC Engine games to my collection. We'll see more soon. All right, let's see if I do this game any justice. Nights into Dreams on the Sega Saturn is a July 1996 3D action game developed by the Sonic team and published by Sega, where you play as the titular Knights, who has to travel through two teenagers' dreams to try and stop the evil Wiseman, with a Z because it's the 90s. He's trying to engulf all of Nightopia into the Nightmare Realm, which would lead to the downfall of the real world, so that's a lot of plot. But go Knights! Go Knights. The game has a little bit of collectathon, a little bit of combat, a little bit of grading how well you did in the level, very much like Sonic games. But put all that together, and this game is actually considered one of the greatest of all time, which is really, really cool. It's also cool because a 3D controller was developed alongside the game, so that's a lot of development to make a whole controller for it, but it is a neat piece of history. The game would be brought to North America in August 1996 and Europe in October 1996, but a Christmas-themed Christmas Nights into Dreams was released all over, starting with Japan in November 1996. So this is all happening in the same year. The game was also ported to PS2 in 2008, only in Japan. It also went to the PS3 store, Xbox Live Arcade in 2012, and also had a sequel, the second game and the most recent game in the series, in December 2007 on the Wii, called Knight's Journey into Dreams. The series has been dormant since, but Knights has had several cameos in all sorts of other Sega series. So that's really cool, and very neat to add two games that are basically the same thing to my collection. Dokoku Soshite on Sega Saturn is a February 1998 visual novel developed by Sakata SAS and published by Data East. Sakata SAS has developed a few Doraemon games, a few Disney games, but most importantly, Burger Time. The game is best described as an escape room visual novel where you play as a male character who normally takes the bus to school, but one day there's an accident. You, people from your school, mostly girls, and some random strangers all wake up in an abandoned mansion. So you're partially escaping the mansion in a variety of different ways, but you're also investigating murders in the mansion and also trying to develop a relationship with one of the 6 female characters, which is kind of funny. It's a weird mix of different game styles. So the game is entirely stuck in Japan, but it did have a remaster and re-release on PS4 and Vita in April 2018 and Switch in November 2019, all of which were developed and published by Aldea. So kind of a weird game, but cool to add to the collection. So as a bit of a background for the next game, the WonderSwan was released by Bandai in Japan in March 1999 as a competitor to the Game Boy line. At the time, the Game Boy Color was out. But the WonderSwan line had 2 more entries, the WonderSwan Color in December 2000 and the Swan Crystal in July 2002, but overall was completely discontinued and never even left Japan. The WonderSwan is designed by the same person that designed the original Game Boy, Gunpei Yokoi, and the first WonderSwan was cheaper, had a longer battery life than the Game Boy Color, but otherwise it's just a quirky handheld system in gaming history. So released for the WonderSwan is Crazy Climber. So Crazy Climber was initially released in arcades in 1980, but was ported almost everywhere, including in North America, the Atari 2600 in 1982, the Famicom in Japan in December 1986, and then the WonderSwan version in July 1999, only in Japan. But it would eventually also come to the PS1, PS2, Android, finally culminating with Hamster's Arcade Archive series with the Switch and PS4 starting in May 2018. So it's a vertical scrolling game initially developed by Nichibutsu and published by Nichibutsu and Taito, but the WonderSwan version was developed and published by Nihon Busan. The entire goal was to climb skyscrapers, so it's kind of like Donkey Kong before Donkey Kong. And while it was successful, it didn't end up keeping up with like the general platforming genre that would follow years after. So I have a few WonderSwan games. This is the first one that I'm showing off. So cool little piece of gaming history with the WonderSwan and the WonderSwan game. So cool. World Heroes is a July 1992 fighting game developed by ADK and published by SNK, originally releasing in Japanese arcades, but it was ported to both the Neo Geo and contemporary systems the following years, including the Super Famicom version, releasing in Japan in August 1993, and then coming to North America just a month later in September 1993. This case, the home release was developed and published by Sunsoft, but still the same game nonetheless. Gameplay is pretty much the same formula that Street Fighter popularized, but World Heroes has its own characters, including the Russian Rasputin, and it was popular enough to kick off its own small series of games, including its sequel, World Heroes 2. A year later, in April 1993, it would also start as an arcade game, get ported everywhere, and it's the same gameplay at its core, but it brought along 7 new playable characters, which is always cool. The series would end up having 2 more games, one in 1994, one in 1995, as well as a 2007 compilation of all 4 games, I'm pretty sure on the PS2, but the series has been dormant otherwise. The game has tried to be revived, brought to modern systems. Hamster has released them starting in January 2017 on the Switch, PS4, and so on. So cool pieces of Super Famicom history that I now own. So that's super cool. Dragon's Crown on PS Vita is a July 2013 action RPG developed by Vanillaware and published by Atlus, same publisher as Dokapon. It was initially released in Japan, but it was brought to North America just a few weeks later in August 2013. The game is best described as a beat-em-up with RPG elements, some dungeon crawling elements. What you do is you start from one of 6 starting classes based on your skill, and then you play as that adventurer. He gets involved in some town happenings. This naturally includes a political coup, slaying dragons, all of which have the ultimate goal of protecting the heir to the throne of the town from those malicious forces. So honestly, name me a game that sounds more like an RPG. The game was released side by side with a PS3 version, but there was a Pro upgrade to the game released for PS4 just a year later, and all of these versions, the Vita, the PS3, the PS4 version, all of them were brought to North America as well. So cool piece of Sony gaming that I now own. The NES had the Zapper, and the Super Nintendo had the Super Scope. So releasing for that Super Scope peripheral, Space Bazooka. So Space Bazooka is an October 1992 light gun shooter developed and published by Nintendo, but it was initially released in North America as Battle Clash. So it's in one of these uncommon occurrences of a Nintendo game initially releasing here and then going to Japan last, in this case, in June 1993, like 8 months after the North American release. So it's one of a handful of Super Scope titles, which, like I said, is the Super Nintendo version of the NES Zapper, and the entire game is mech/tank battles where you are a member of Mike Anderson's tank trying to take down Anubis and his associates in a variety of different ways against a variety of different fight patterns. So the post-game encourages playing at higher difficulties, completing it in quicker times, and honestly the game kind of sounds like if We Play Tanks was a shooter, which is kind of funny. And there was a sequel that would be released just a year later, but it was only in North America and in Europe, since the Super Scope wasn't a big hit, wasn't a big deal in Japan. So cool piece of Nintendo history here. A very strange game to be developed and published by Nintendo, but they like their tanks. Here's an odd little fish. Nushi Tsuri 64 Shiokaze Ninote on N64. This is a May 2000 fishing simulator sequel developed by Victor Interactive Software and published by Packin Video. So Victor has a huge library they've worked on. Quick peek just shows Ys, Tomb Raider, Harvest Moon, but there's literally so many different games. So the fact that there's a fishing game in their library is like a really funny departure from everything else. So this game is a sequel to Plain Nushi Tsuri 64 2 years prior, but both games are part of this bigger Legend of the River King series, which I have literally never heard of before. But this game specifically had transfer pack capability on the Nintendo 64 with Legend of the River King 2 on Game Boy Color, or in Japan it was Kawa no Nushi Tsuri 4, so it was already the 4th game in the series at the time. So, like I said, this one's an odd little fish, but there's a 5-hour long play of it on YouTube. You should definitely go check it out, but I was not about to sit through it for this 1 minute long short. But still, we love game studios doing fishing sims for no reason, so pretty cool. Bottom. Oh. Dracula Densetsu 2 is a July 1991 2D platformer developed and published by Konami, but I think it's better known by its North American name, Castlevania 2 Belmont's Revenge, releasing just a month later in August 1991 on the original Game Boy. So this game is a sequel to the first Castlevania title on Game Boy, both of which are different than the first 2 Castlevanias on NES. However, the overall gameplay is the same. Gameplay-wise, the only real difference is that this game is kind of Mega Man-like, where you could play worlds in any order, but story-wise, you play as the great-grandfather of the iconic Simon Belmont 15 years after the first Game Boy title. Your goal in this game is to rescue your son from Dracula. It's always Dracula causing a problem. And I'm not the biggest Castlevania fan, but I do find the series very fascinating history-wise, and I got really into learning about the timeline. So Castlevania 3 on NES is 97 years before the first Game Boy Castlevania. This game is 15 years after that Game Boy Castlevania, but then the first Castlevania, like the iconic Castlevania 1, is set 100 years after this game. So very all intertwined. Like I said, wish I was more into the series, but the timelining is super fascinating. This game was included in a couple re-releases, most specifically the Japanese and European exclusive Konami collections on Game Boy and Game Boy Color, but it did get a re-release finally in North America on the Castlevania Anniversary Collection on all modern systems in May 2019. So a really cool piece to add to the collection for Castlevania. I bought East 2 on Famicom and East 1 and 2 on the PC Engine CD, but I'm not at all qualified to talk about this series, so instead, let me show you something completely different. I got some Madden games on Japanese consoles. So we have Madden 2001 Super Bowl, we have Madden 2006 also on PS2, and of course the Scott the Woz Legend Madden 08 on Xbox 360, and it has a green disc. How cool is that? So first of all, why do these exist? Is American football that popular in Japan? Why do these exist? And number two, why do I have them? Oh, so you liked it when I talked about American football games on Japanese systems in the last short. Well, this time I have Ultimate Football on Super Famicom, which was released in Japan in July 1992 and developed and published by Sammy Studios, the same company responsible for the early Guilty Gear games, so kind of a funny developer to also be working on American football games. But it took over a year later for it to come to North America in October 1993 as Football Fury. So it's another run-of-the-mill American football game. They use fictional teams, but the cities the fictional teams are in are the same series that NFL teams were in the early 90s, so kind of a interesting cross between fiction and nonfiction, but it was also marketed as a game that was easier to pick up and play than, say, the Madden series, which was pretty young when this game was released. And I always find it funny when Japan gets these like very heavily American games, but in this case it's even funnier because Japan got this game first, and then we got it so much later, which just adds to it being funny. Alex Kidd Tenku Majo on the Sega Mega Drive is a February 1989 2D side-scroller developed and published by Sega as the only 16-bit game in the Alex Kidd series that started on the Master System in 1986, just 3 years earlier. The game would come to North America just 6 months later in August 1989 as Alex Kidd in the Enchanted Castle. The whole series seems to be this comical platforming series, and that's also true here as you play as the titular Alex as he platforms and plays rock, paper, scissors everywhere in search of his father, King Thor. But if you lose in rock, paper, scissors, you lose your clothing and you only get a leaf to cover it up. In the North American version on the Genesis, that losing rock, paper, scissors would just get changed to being flattened, which isn't really surprising for North American censorship in this time. But the game was popular enough to be ported a ton of places, including the Wii Virtual Console in 2007, computers in 2010 and 2019, and tons of other Sega compilations over time. We talked about this series all the way back in my first Japanese N64 video, but Doraemon is a Japanese media franchise that started as a manga in 1969 and has since exploded into basically every other form of media, making it one of the most recognizable Japanese animation characters like ever. So Doraemon 2, Nobita to Ikari no Shinden on N64 is one of many games in the franchise, being released in December 1998 and developed and published by Epoch, the same developer responsible for tons of Doraemon's early games, other Japanese media franchises, but also some Disney games and even Dragon Slayer. So the game is an action-adventure where you are looking for specific hidden treasure in a hidden temple, but there's also plenty of puzzle and collectathon elements, all of these elements of which were very popular for Doraemon games back then. So very cool to add another game to the collection. People have been hacking game systems as long as video games have been around. I'm guilty of this. I used to use an action replay on my DS in Pokemon Diamond to give myself level 100 Pokemon that weren't normally found in Pokemon Diamond. But I stumbled across a handful of Japanese hacking devices for the original Game Boy. So speaking of Action Replay, the company that developed and published the Action Replay, along with like basically every other hacking device for every other system in North America, that company was called Detel. But in Japan, Detel's hacking products were published by a company called Carat, as in like 24 karat gold. So by Carat, we have the Carrot Pro Action Replay, the Carrot Pro Action Replay 3, and the Carrot Pro Action Replay 4 Max. That's me. But then we also have this weird little guy, the Exterminator Z, which was basically the same thing, but everything I see in a quick Google search doesn't have anything listed about it. So that's cool, I guess. And you know, just you're lucky I can't fit all of these into my mouth, so we're just gonna end the video there. Bye. On Super Famicom, Lady Stalker Kakokara no Chosen, or Lady Stalker Challenge from the Past, is an April Fool's Day 1995 RPG with a title that doesn't seem joke-worthy, but let me explain. This game was developed by Climax and published by Taito, but Climax also developed the game Land Stalker, initially releasing on the Sega Mega Drive in October 1992, and it came to North America just 8 months later in August 1993 on the Genesis. But this game is a female-centric spin-off of that game. It's mostly the same game as the isometric action RPG Landstalker, but the biggest changes are now the inability to jump, which was apparently kind of weird for the genre at the time, and a bigger focus on RPG elements as opposed to action elements that Landstalker had. So for example, the battles are now random instead of, you know, like approaching something by the player, but I think the story is overall similar in that you're searching for treasure, but I don't know, at this point, man, this just seems weird. This is apparently the only Landstalker game to never leave Japan. However, there was a Japan-only mobile game, also named Lady Stalker, that would technically be the second Lady Stalker game in the series, but it's also not a remake. Yeah, weird. This game needs no introduction, but the original Space Invaders released in Japanese arcades in June 1978 and came to North America just 4 months later in October 1978. It's a vertical shooter that I personally find incredibly frustrating, but simply put, this is one of the most golden era arcade games ever, ranking highly on tons of greatest arcade games ever list, influential games lists, and that shows in its legacy with the original game being ported literally everywhere, including the Atari 2600 in North America and the Famicom in April 1985. It's kind of interesting. It was released on the Famicom, but never came to North America on the NES. Came everywhere else, but just not on the NES, despite having a Famicom version. I don't even know why I'm still talking about this game. It's cool to own one of the first home ports in Japanese, but if you don't know what this game is, go to an arcade and play it, like, right now. In the last short, we talked about one of the most influential video games ever, but in this short, we're going to talk about one of the most recognizable game series ever. Dance Dance Revolution is a rhythm game series developed and published by Konami, initially releasing in Japanese arcades in November 1998, where your feet are the controller. So the setup is that it has these metal panels on the floor, and up, down, left, and right, and your feet are just meant to press those 4 panels in rhythm game fashion. So I've always really been bad at DDR, but I'll never forget being on a date a few years ago where she said, "Let's play that." And I got stomped, but I had never seen somebody's legs move so fast. It was insane, but also really impressive. If you're watching my channel, there's no way you haven't seen these games in one form or another, but I've got 2 interesting DDR games to show. The first one on N64 is Dance Dance Revolution Disney Dancing Museum, which is a November 2000 rhythm game developed by KCEK, and believe it or not, it's Disney DDR. There are 22 Disney songs, all mostly from the Mickey Mouse universe as opposed to like the movies, but most importantly has It's a Small World, so like that makes the game, honestly. It was the first DDR game on a Nintendo home console, but not the first DDR game on a Nintendo system at all. There were 2 Game Boy Color games right before this one, and then 3 Game Boy Color games right after this one of which was also Disney themed. So this game and those 5 games were all stuck in Japan, but the first DDR on a Nintendo console to leave Japan was Dance Dance Revolution with Mario. So this game's Japanese, but it initially released in Japan in July 2005, but came to North America 3 months later in October 2005 as Dance Dance Revolution Mario Mix. The Disney game was obviously Disney, and this one is very Nintendo-centric, with the songs being based off both Nintendo music and public domain music, but then being themed with Nintendo franchises. So some songs are from the NES era, like Super Mario Bros., Wrecking Crew, Yoshi's Cookie, but some are more recent for the time, like Mario Kart Double Dash, Mario Party 5, and Paper Mario The Thousand Year Door, all from the GameCube era. There would end up being 8 more DDR games on the Wii, another of which was Disney-themed, but no official DDR games have been released on Nintendo systems since 2011, so that's kind of sad. I also didn't have a chance to mention it, but both games also had dance mats included, and that's basically how you played these games. So cool to get these like really big bundles when you bought these games brand new. So you've all played Wii Play, but have you ever heard of its sequel, Wii Remocon Plus Variety? This is a June 2011 Wii Play sequel / minigame collection published by Nintendo. But in the original Wii Play, all of the minigames in the collection were also developed by Nintendo. In the sequel, however, all of the minigames were developed by different studios, like Chunsoft, Goodfeel, and ND Cube. Also kind of weird, the game was initially released in North America first under the title Wii Play Motion, but then it came to Japan a month later in July 2011, so even weirder that like it's a Nintendo published game that was initially released in North America first. The goal of this minigame collection was to show off the use of the Wii Motion Plus peripheral, whose only goal was to give the Wii Remote greater motion accuracy, but that's not really a big jump, and this game did not receive or sell well compared to the original. The original was bundled with a Wii Remote, and that was a huge reason why it sold well. It was also released early in the Wii's lifespan, so this game was just like destined to fail. Not only is it the second worst selling Wii series game behind Wii Chess, it was also released after the Wii U's launch. So like, what are you doing, Nintendo?